The year is 1973. You're standing on a Volkswagen dealership lot somewhere in sunny California, and parked right there between a Beetle and a microbus is something that looks like it escaped from a military surplus auction, got confused, made a wrong turn, and somehow ended up with a price sticker on its windshield. No proper roof. Doors you could literally lift off with your bare hands. A windshield that folded completely flat. A shape so aggressively boxy it looked like someone designed it with a ruler. A bad attitude, and absolutely zero interest in the concept of aerodynamics. And the name on the brochure? Not the Explorer. Not the Adventurer. Not even something vaguely sensible like the Volkswagen Open. No. They called it The Thing. Just The Thing. Like they were naming a horror movie or a placeholder in a presentation that never got updated. And here is the part that makes this story genuinely remarkable. The United States government essentially forced Volkswagen to pull it from the American market after just 2 years and roughly 31,000 units. Not because it exploded, not because it was catastrophically unreliable, but because it was so militarily honest, so stripped of pretense, so fundamentally unbothered by the concept of regulatory compliance, that the growing apparatus of American automotive safety and emissions law simply could not accommodate it. That is the story we are getting into today, the Volkswagen Thing. A vehicle so weird it became iconic, so short-lived it became rare, and so genuinely different from everything else that 5 decades later, it has one of the most passionate collector communities of any car from its era. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the cars that history treated better than the marketplace ever did. If you're someone who loves digging into the stories behind the weird ones, the forgotten ones, the vehicles that failed commercially but won culturally, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here is the thing, and I mean that in both senses of the word. To really understand what the Volkswagen Thing was and why it existed at all, you cannot start in 1973. You cannot even start in the late 1960s when Volkswagen first began developing the civilian version that would eventually reach American shores. You have to go all the way back to the Second World War, to a conflict that reshaped the entire planet and, somewhat incidentally, produced one of the most durable and influential small vehicle platforms in automotive history. During the war, Volkswagen produced a military utility vehicle called the Kübelwagen. That name translates roughly to bucket car. And yes, that is a completely real name that serious adults gave to a real vehicle that was used in actual combat. The Kübelwagen was designed with direct involvement from Ferdinand Porsche himself, which is one of those historical footnotes that reminds you how complicated the legacies of genuinely brilliant engineers tend to be. It was light. It was simple. It was air-cooled, which meant it did not need a radiator and was far less vulnerable to the kinds of mechanical failures that plagued water-cooled vehicles in extreme conditions. It was, in the most fundamental sense, a vehicle optimized for usefulness rather than comfort or image. And it worked. The German military used it extensively across multiple theaters of the war, in the African desert, on the Eastern Front, in Western Europe. It was not glamorous, it was not fast, but it went where it needed to go. It kept running when other vehicles would have quit, and it did the job. After the war ended and Volkswagen began the remarkable process of rebuilding itself into one of the most successful automotive companies in the world, the military vehicle concept went dormant for a couple of decades. The Beetle took center stage and the rest, as they say, is marketing history. But by the late 1960s, militaries and government agencies across the world were still looking for exactly the kind of simple, rugged, air-cooled utility vehicle that the Kübelwagen had represented. And Volkswagen, recognizing that market, developed a new version of that formula called the Type 181. The Type 181 entered production in West Germany in 1969. The Bundeswehr, the German Federal Defense Force, adopted it as a light utility transport. The Mexican army bought fleets of them and called them the Safari. Various NATO-affiliated countries picked them up for similar purposes. None of this was glamorous. None of it was intended to be. The Type 181 was not designed to be photographed at auto shows. It was designed to be useful, affordable, and simple enough that a moderately trained mechanic with basic tools could keep it running in the field. It was the automotive equivalent of a good hammer. And then somebody at Volkswagen of America had an idea. A genuinely strange, counterintuitive, and ultimately fascinating idea. They looked at this boxy military utility vehicle, this tool built for armies, and they saw a lifestyle product. They saw something that a generation of young Americans, people who were obsessed with beaches and surfing and camping and the general concept of doing whatever they wanted wherever they wanted, might actually want to buy. Look, it was the early 1970s. The counterculture had peaked, but its spirit was still very much alive in the American consumer market. The outdoor lifestyle category was growing. The concept of the fun vehicle, the recreational vehicle, the thing you bought not because you needed it, but because it made your weekends better, was starting to crystallize as a real product category. And Volkswagen of America decided the Type 181 could live in that space. They imported it. They gave it a name that was either a stroke of marketing genius or a complete accident of corporate indifference, depending on who you ask. And they put it on dealership lots in 1973 at a base price of around $2,350. And America, at least certain parts of America, absolutely lost its mind over it. Here is what most people do not realize about the launch of the Thing in the United States. The name itself was not originally the plan. In Mexico, it was the Safari. In other markets, it had more conventional designations. But in America, someone made the call to just call it the Thing. And that decision turned out to be one of the most accidentally brilliant pieces of automotive branding in the history of the business. Think about how that plays out in everyday conversation. What did you drive to the beach? The Thing. What is parked in your driveway? The Thing. What did you just spend $2,000 on at the Volkswagen dealer? The Thing. You could not write better word-of-mouth marketing if you had a team of consultants working on it for 6 months. The name created curiosity. The name created conversation. The name made the vehicle impossible to forget or describe without sounding slightly surreal. And surreal was, intentionally or not, exactly the right tone for this particular vehicle at this particular moment in American cultural history. Now you might be thinking, okay, the name is funny and the backstory is interesting, but what was the Volkswagen Thing actually like as a machine? What were you actually getting when you handed over your $2,350 and drove one of these things off the lot? And the honest answer is that you were getting something genuinely unlike anything else available in the American new car market at that moment in time. Let me walk you through it, because the specifics matter here. The Thing rode on a wheelbase of approximately 94.5 inches, which put it solidly in the compact category. Curb weight was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 pounds, which is remarkably, almost suspiciously light by modern standards, but was still competitive territory in the early 1970s economy car market. The powertrain was the air-cooled flat four that Volkswagen had been refining and deploying across its entire lineup since the post-war years. In the Thing's case, this was a 1,600 cubic centimeter unit producing a figure that the word modest does not adequately describe. 46 horsepower, not 460, not 246. 46. To put that in some context that actually lands properly, a base 1973 Chevrolet Impala produced somewhere around 175 horsepower. A Pontiac GTO from the same era was making north of 250. The Thing was making 46. This is a vehicle that required genuine commitment on freeway on-ramps. Merging was less of a maneuver and more of a philosophical statement about patience. But here is what the Thing offered in exchange for that rather modest power output. It offered a degree of openness and convertibility that no other street-legal production vehicle in America could touch. The canvas top came off completely, not just folded down in the manner of a conventional convertible, but physically removed and set aside. The doors, all 4 of them, could be lifted off their hinges by one person in a matter of seconds. No tools required. Just lift and set aside. And the windshield itself, the entire windshield frame, folded completely flat down onto the hood. What this meant in practice was that in its most open configuration, the Volkswagen Thing was essentially a very boxy, very slow, but thoroughly street-legal motorized open platform with turn signals and a registration plate. The suspension was torsion bar all the way around, simple and robust in the way that military-derived hardware tends to be. Brakes were drums on all four corners, which was not exceptional for the era, but was also not going to win any awards for stopping performance. The whole mechanical package was, to use the technical term, absolutely basic. And basic in this case was a feature rather than a bug, because basic meant that a competent home mechanic with a modest set of tools and access to the enormous aftermarket ecosystem that had grown up around air-cooled Volkswagens could maintain and repair a thing without needing a dealership, a specialist, or a particularly large budget. The styling of the thing is one of those topics that people either immediately understand or never understand, and very few people fall in the middle. The body panels were flat, not gently curved, not subtly sculpted, genuinely flat, as though someone had decided that the concept of compound curves was an unnecessary complication and simply declined to participate. The silhouette was upright and boxy in a way that made it look, depending on your perspective, either charmingly utilitarian or aggressively unapologetic. The front end featured round headlights set into a flat vertical face that gave the vehicle an expression somewhere between puzzled and quietly judgmental, and the whole ensemble, taken together, looked like a child had drawn a military vehicle with great confidence and minimal artistic training. And that drawing had somehow been taken entirely seriously by an actual manufacturing facility. Two colors were available for the initial American market launch in 1973: pumpkin orange and sunshine yellow. Because if you are going to sell something this weird, you might as well commit completely to the visibility angle and ensure that nobody within a half-mile radius can miss you. Now here's what most people do not realize when they first encounter the thing's specifications on paper. The numbers, the 46 horsepower, the basic suspension, the drum brakes, tell you almost nothing about what it was actually like to drive and experience this vehicle. Because the thing was not a car that existed in the realm of specifications and comparison charts. It was a car that existed in the realm of feeling and experience, and the very specific joy of driving something that makes no compromises whatsoever in pursuit of the conventional. You could not be anonymous in a thing. You could not blend into traffic. You could not be unremarkable. Wherever you went, whatever you were doing, the thing announced itself with complete confidence and zero apology. And the people who loved that quality loved it with an intensity that the vehicle's modest specifications could never fully explain. The marketing approach that Volkswagen of America developed for the thing leaned fully into this experiential angle. The advertisements did not talk about horsepower or handling dynamics or cargo capacity. They talked about beach access and sun and the wind in your hair, and the freedom of driving something that reflected your personality rather than your practicality. And in certain pockets of America, this message landed with extraordinary precision. Southern California dealers moved things faster than they could get them. Florida was strong territory. College towns across the country became reliable markets because the thing spoke directly to people who were making lifestyle statements with their vehicle choices rather than transportation decisions. The cabriolet version of the thing, with its slightly more refined folding top and marginally higher price point, appealed to buyers who wanted the experience but preferred their open-air motoring to come with a slightly greater illusion of shelter. It was still basically the same vehicle underneath, but the existence of the cabriolet told you something important about how Volkswagen was positioning the whole product line. They were not selling transportation. They were selling a way of being in the world. And for one brief, shining 2-model-year window in American automotive history, it worked. This is where it gets really interesting, because the story of the thing does not just end with declining sales or a strategic business decision to move on to other products. It ends with a confrontation between an utterly honest, utterly simple vehicle and the increasingly complex machinery of American federal regulation. And that confrontation, when you understand it fully, tells you as much about the early 1970s American automotive landscape as it does about the thing itself. To understand what happened, you need to appreciate what was going on in Washington during this period. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had been building out its framework of federal motor vehicle safety standards throughout the late 1960s and into the early 1970s. These standards were becoming more comprehensive, more specific, and more stringent with each passing year. Bumper impact standards, rollover protection requirements, side impact door strength specifications, windshield retention standards. Each of these was being codified and enforced with increasing seriousness as the regulatory apparatus expanded its scope and its confidence. Simultaneously, the Environmental Protection Agency was doing the same thing on the emissions side, establishing catalytic converter requirements and exhaust composition standards that were going to fundamentally change what engines automakers could legally sell in the United States market. Now, this was challenging for everybody in the car business. Every single manufacturer selling vehicles in America was dealing with the engineering and cost implications of meeting these new standards. But it was a particularly acute challenge if your product was a vehicle that had been designed in the late 1960s for military utility applications, in which the words American Federal Safety Compliance had never appeared in any design brief ever. The specific compliance problems with the thing were not subtle. They were comprehensive and serious. Start with the rollover protection situation. The thing's canvas top provided exactly zero structural protection in the event of a vehicle rollover. Zero. The canvas was decorative, not structural. Under NHTSA's evolving standards for occupant protection and rollover events, this was not a workable situation. The doors presented a separate and equally serious problem. Because the doors were designed to be removed entirely, they could not be engineered to meet side impact intrusion standards in any meaningful way. A door whose primary design feature is that you can lift it off with your bare hands is, by definition, not a door that will protect occupants in a side impact collision. The bumper situation was another failure point. The new federal bumper standards that were coming into effect required vehicles to withstand low-speed impacts without damage to safety systems, and the thing's simple, pressed steel bumpers were nowhere near that standard. And then there was the folding windshield. The ability to fold the windshield flat onto the hood, while genuinely wonderful as a feature and thoroughly in keeping with the vehicle's military heritage, created compliance questions around windshield retention and occupant protection in frontal impacts that were genuinely difficult to resolve. On top of all of this, the 1600 cubic centimeter air-cooled engine was going to struggle with the emission standards that were tightening around the industry. The air-cooled architecture, while legendarily durable and simple, was not well suited to the kind of precise fuel metering and exhaust treatment that meeting the new emission requirements demanded. Volkswagen's engineering team ran the numbers. What would it cost to bring the thing into full compliance with the trajectory of American federal safety and emission standards? The honest answer was a lot. A genuinely significant investment in engineering and tooling that would result in a vehicle substantially more expensive than the original $2,350 entry point that had been central to the thing's value proposition. And here is the brutal mathematics of the situation. The thing's appeal to American buyers was built on three pillars. It was cheap, it was fun, it was different. If compliance costs pushed the price up dramatically, you were left with fun and different, which are genuinely valuable qualities but are not sufficient on their own to sustain a viable sales volume at a significantly higher price point, especially when you were dealing with a vehicle that still had 46 horsepower and no real weather protection. The business case for continued American market investment simply did not work. And so, after the 1974 model year, after approximately 31,000 units had found American homes across those two model years, Volkswagen made the decision to withdraw the thing from the United States market. It is worth pausing here to note what did not happen, because the popular telling of this story sometimes implies that the government walked up to Volkswagen and handed them a formal prohibition order in the manner of a cease and desist letter. That is not quite what occurred. What occurred was something more subtle, and in many ways more telling about how regulatory pressure actually works in practice. The government did not ban the thing. The government created a regulatory environment in which the Thing could not survive without investments that the business case did not justify. The effect was identical to a ban, but the mechanism was the quiet economic pressure of compliance costs rather than a dramatic formal prohibition. The Thing was not killed. It was priced out of existence by the gap between what it was and what the rules required it to become. There is something almost philosophically interesting about that distinction, and it tells you something important about how the American regulatory framework of that era shaped the automotive market in ways that were not always visible on the surface. And here is the bitter irony that sits at the heart of this whole story. The Thing was not a dangerous vehicle in any active or dramatic sense. It was not the Pinto, sitting on a fuel tank arrangement that created catastrophic fire risk in rear impacts. It was not the Corvair with its swing-axle suspension characteristics that had inspired Ralph Nader's landmark investigation. It was a simple, honest, slow vehicle that had been designed for military utility purposes and that carried into its civilian life the same stripped-down honesty that had made it useful in those military applications. Its failure to comply with American standards was not a moral failure. It was a category failure. It was a vehicle built for one set of requirements being evaluated against a completely different set of requirements. And that gap between what the Thing was designed to be and what American law required it to be was ultimately what ended its brief American chapter. Now, you might be thinking that the story of the Thing ends there. 31,000 units, 2 model years, a regulatory wall that the economics could not overcome. Fade to black. But here is the thing about cars that get cut down before they have the chance to become ordinary. They do not fade to black, they fade to legend. And the Volkswagen Thing has had one of the more remarkable second acts of any vehicle in the American collector car world. Before we get into that second act, though, it is worth understanding the broader context in which the Thing's American failure took place, because that context explains a lot about why Volkswagen made the decisions it made and why those decisions felt, at the time, like reasonable business logic rather than a cultural tragedy in slow motion. The early 1970s were a genuinely disorienting period for Volkswagen of America. The entire brand's American identity had been built on the Beetle. Not just built on it, but essentially synonymous with it. The Think Small advertising campaign that DDB had created for Volkswagen in the early 1960s was not just one of the great automotive advertising campaigns. It was one of the great advertising campaigns, full stop, across any product category. It had positioned Volkswagen not merely as a car company but as an attitude, a philosophy, a particular way of seeing the world and your place in it. The Beetle was the honest, unpretentious, sensible antidote to American excess. It was the car for people who saw through the annual model year charade, who did not need fins and chrome and horsepower theater to feel good about their transportation choices. And that positioning had worked brilliantly, turning Volkswagen into a genuine American cultural phenomenon through the mid and late 1960s. The problem, arriving with all the inevitability of a slowly approaching deadline, was that the Beetle was getting old in ways that clever marketing could not indefinitely obscure. The air-cooled, rear-engine, rear-wheel drive architecture that had defined the car since its origins was becoming genuinely antiquated as the rest of the automotive world moved toward water-cooled front-engine configurations. The emissions compliance situation was getting increasingly difficult. The safety compliance situation was generating similar headaches. The Beetle was not going to fail dramatically or suddenly. It was going to fade, which in some ways is harder to manage than a dramatic failure because the decision about when to acknowledge it and how to respond is never obviously clear. So what do? You try things. Volkswagen of America tried the Type 3, a more conventional notchback and fastback Volkswagen that American buyers largely greeted with polite indifference. They tried the Type 4, which did not fare much better. There was the interesting but commercially challenged collaboration with Porsche that produced the Type 914, a genuinely compelling mid-engine sports car that fell into the peculiar commercial no-man's land of being too expensive to be a Volkswagen and not prestigious enough to be a proper Porsche. And there was the Thing, the lifestyle play, the attempt to carve out a new product category that the Beetle could never occupy. Look, none of these were irrational decisions. They were all reasonable attempts to find the next thing, no pun intended, for a brand that had built itself on one iconic product that was approaching the end of its viable life. The problem was that none of them worked well enough to provide the bridge that Volkswagen needed. What ultimately saved Volkswagen in America was the Golf, which arrived here in 1975 under the name Rabbit. Water-cooled. Front-wheel drive. Front engine. Fuel-efficient in ways that the oil crisis of 1973 had suddenly made extremely relevant to American car buyers. Practical. Modern. And still, unmistakably, a Volkswagen in its character and in its commitment to the idea that a small car could be genuinely good, rather than merely acceptable. The Rabbit pointed the brand in the right direction and gave it the foundation it needed for the next several decades of American market success. But the Rabbit arrived in 1975, which was the same year the Thing departed, and in the years between the fading of the Beetle and the arrival of the Rabbit, Volkswagen was in a genuinely strange transitional place. The Thing was one of the peculiar artifacts of that in-between period, a vehicle that existed in the gap between what Volkswagen had been and what it was becoming. And perhaps that is part of why its story resonates so strongly with people who love automotive history. There is something uniquely poignant about the car that existed in the gap, the vehicle that tried to answer a question that turned out to be the wrong question, that nevertheless found its audience and built its community despite never getting the chance to properly establish itself. The geographical reality of the Thing's American sales story is also worth examining because it illuminates both the vehicle's genuine appeal and the structural limitations that made genuine commercial success essentially impossible regardless of the regulatory situation. The Thing was a warm-weather vehicle in a way that was not merely a preference but a genuine engineering reality. The canvas top leaked. The doors, even when installed, had gaps and sealing characteristics that made wind noise at highway speeds genuinely fatiguing over any extended distance. The heating system, shared with the Beetle and carrying all of the inadequacies that Beetle owners had been cheerfully complaining about for decades, was not going to keep you comfortable on a cold day, regardless of how optimistically you adjusted the controls. The heater in an air-cooled Volkswagen is one of those features that works in the sense that it technically exists while not working in the sense that it actually keeps you warm when the temperature drops below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. If you live in Southern California or Florida or coastal Texas or Arizona, these are manageable compromises. You might deal with cool mornings in the Thing and accept that. If you live in Michigan or Minnesota or anywhere in the Northeast where winter is a season that actually requires a coat and scraping ice off windshields, the Thing was not a viable primary transportation option. It was not even a viable secondary transportation option for 6 months of the year. And that geographical limitation meant that no matter how enthusiastic the coastal and Sunbelt markets were, the Thing was always working with a fundamentally restricted potential customer base. The heartland of America, which represented a huge proportion of the total car-buying population, was largely unmoved by what the Thing was offering, because what the Thing was offering did not solve any of their actual problems. 25,000 units in year one was genuinely respectable for a niche lifestyle vehicle. But niche was all it was ever going to be. And niche, combined with the compliance cost problem, was not a combination that Volkswagen could build a sustainable business case around. The math was always working against the Thing in America, even before the regulatory walls started closing in. Here is what most people do not realize about the Volkswagen Thing's legacy. The vehicle that failed commercially, that got squeezed out of its primary market after 2 model years and 31,000 units, that was too honest and too military and too stripped down to survive the tightening of American federal standards. That same vehicle went on to build one of the most passionate and genuinely engaged owner communities of any automobile from its era. And the reasons for that are not accidental. They are rooted in the very qualities that made the thing commercially challenging in the first place. Start with the numbers, because the numbers tell an important story. Approximately 31,000 things were imported to the United States across the 1973 and 1974 model years. That is not a large number by any mainstream metric. To put it in perspective, Ford was selling well over 1 million F-Series trucks per year during this period. Even within the Volkswagen lineup, the Beetle was moving hundreds of thousands of units annually in the American market at its peak. 31,000 total for the entire American run of a vehicle. Now take those 31,000 units and think about what happened to them in the decades that followed. These were not pampered garage queens when they were new. They were beach cars, farm vehicles, general-purpose fun machines. They got driven hard in the elements. They got used. They got wet. They got sandy. They got modified by people who wanted more power or different suspension or any number of other improvements over the already modest stock specification. The survival rate among original, unmodified, presentable examples is not high. And that scarcity, that genuine rarity created by low production numbers combined with heavy use in the passage of 50-plus years, has done what scarcity always does to collector value. It has pushed prices dramatically upward from the vehicle's humble original sticker price. A solid, honest, unmodified 1973 or 1974 thing in good condition with presentable original paint and a documented history is a vehicle that will change hands today for somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000. And exceptional examples with particularly good provenance or unusual specifications have gone meaningfully higher than that. Consider the mathematics of that appreciation. An original sticker price of approximately $2,350 for the base model. Current market value for a nice example of somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000. That represents an appreciation factor of roughly 7 to 10 times the original purchase price over 50 years, which is not a spectacular investment return compared to some collector car categories, but which is genuinely remarkable for a vehicle that was regulated out of its primary market after 2 years and that, at the time of its withdrawal, would have been widely considered a commercial disappointment. The modification community that has grown up around the thing is a story in itself, and one that reflects both the vehicle's inherent simplicity and its membership in the much larger ecosystem of air-cooled Volkswagen culture. Because the thing shared its fundamental mechanical architecture with the Beetle and the Bus and various other Volkswagen products of the era, the knowledge base, the parts availability, the aftermarket ecosystem, and the community of enthusiasts who had developed deep expertise in these vehicles was already enormous when thing ownership started becoming a collector pursuit. You did not need to find a specialist who understood a unique and obscure mechanical package. You needed someone who understood air-cooled Volkswagens, and those people were everywhere. What this meant in practical terms was that the modification potential of the thing was essentially unlimited from a community support standpoint. People began stuffing Porsche flat-six engines into things, creating vehicles that retained the vehicle's cheerfully absurd visual character while adding performance capabilities that the original 46-horsepower powertrain could not have imagined. Proper off-road builds emerged, with lifted suspensions, locking differentials, and all-terrain tire packages that actually delivered on the original military vehicle promise of genuine capability in rough terrain. Restomod builds appeared that updated the braking system, the fuel delivery, the suspension geometry, and various other mechanical systems while keeping the exterior looking original, or close to it. And on the other end of the spectrum, purist restoration builds focused on preserving or recreating factory-correct examples with period-correct colors, original mechanical specifications, and documented histories. The breadth of the modification and restoration community that exists around the thing today reflects the genuinely inclusive nature of air-cooled Volkswagen culture, which has always been a world where the stock purist and the wild modifier coexist with unusual mutual respect, because they are united by a shared appreciation for the fundamental appeal of these vehicles rather than divided by disagreements about the correct way to express that appreciation. Thing-specific clubs and registries operate across the United States and internationally. Annual gatherings draw owners from across the country and increasingly from other continents. Because the Type 181 in its various global iterations, the Trekker sold in some European markets, the Safari sold in Mexico, the base German market Type 181 in its various configurations, created a global community of enthusiasts that the American Thing community is connected to in ways that enrich the overall ownership experience. The German survivor examples are particularly interesting from a collector perspective because they were often used in different ways than American examples, and sometimes survive in different states of preservation. Some have been imported to the United States by enthusiasts who specifically wanted something slightly different from a standard American specification car, creating a small but growing subset of the American collector Thing market that consists of properly documented European examples. This is where it gets really interesting from a cultural legacy standpoint. The Thing got cut down before it had the chance to become ordinary. It never had the opportunity to be the sensible choice, the practical option, the vehicle that people bought because it made logical sense for their transportation needs. It remained, by virtue of its brief production run and its subsequent scarcity, permanently weird, permanently niche, permanently the kind of vehicle that required a specific kind of person to seek it out, understand it, and commit to it. And that permanent weirdness, that enduring status as the vehicle that never became normal, is precisely what has made it such a durable object of passion and affection among the people who love it. Compare this to vehicles that were similarly quirky in their day but that sold in sufficient numbers to become part of the mainstream automotive furniture. The novelty fades when familiarity accumulates. The Thing never accumulated enough familiarity to lose its novelty. Every example you encounter feels like a discovery rather than a reminder of something you have seen 100 times before. And in the collector car world, that quality of persistent freshness, the ability to still surprise and delight people who encounter it, is extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily rare. If you are thinking seriously about acquiring a Thing today, and look, if you have watched this far into this video, there is a reasonable chance that thought has crossed your mind at least once in the last 20 minutes. Then there are some practical realities that you need to understand before you start making phone calls or clicking on listings. Because the Thing collector market has matured significantly over the last decade, and the days of finding a legitimate barn discovery for $3,000 are largely, though not entirely, behind us. The most important single thing to evaluate in any Thing purchase prospect is rust. Full stop. End of discussion. Start there and let everything else be secondary. The flat body panels of the Thing, while visually distinctive and mechanically simple to replace in theory, have a particular relationship with moisture and time that can turn an apparently solid-looking example into a restoration nightmare once you start probing beneath the surface. The floor pans, the frame rails, the areas around the door openings, the structural elements beneath the body, all of these are areas where moisture gets in, gets trapped, and works on the metal over the subsequent decades in ways that are not always visible from a casual external inspection. A pre-purchase inspection from someone who specifically knows air-cooled Volkswagens and ideally has particular experience with things is not optional. It is the price of admission to doing this correctly. The mechanical components are, relatively speaking, the easy part of a Thing ownership situation. Parts availability for the air-cooled Volkswagen platform is exceptional. The aftermarket for these vehicles is extensive, active, and well-stocked with both reproduction parts for restoration purposes and upgraded components for the people who want to improve on the original specifications. The community knowledge base is deep and generously shared. You can find forums, registries, club resources, and experienced mechanics in most parts of the country who can work on these vehicles competently. If you find a Thing with solid structure and good bones, you can address mechanical deficiencies without catastrophic expense, and you can do so with the support of a community that actively wants to help you succeed, because that is the kind of culture that has grown up around these vehicles. The color situation is something worth paying attention to as well, because the color your thing wears has a meaningful effect on both its visual character and its market value. The original American market colors, pumpkin orange and sunshine yellow for the initial 1973 launch, and additional colors introduced for 1974, including a particularly fetching shade of green, each have their partisans and their detractors in the community. Original color cars in good condition with documented histories tend to command premiums over repainted examples, because originality and documentation are always valuable in the collector market, and become more valuable as the vehicles age and the pool of genuinely original examples shrinks. Now here is a broader observation about the thing's place in automotive history that I think deserves some direct attention, because it connects this specific story to a pattern that shows up repeatedly when you look at the cars that time has been kinder to than the marketplace ever was. The thing failed commercially in the United States. That is not a debatable point. 31,000 units over 2 model years, followed by a withdrawal driven by the gap between the vehicle's fundamental character and the regulatory requirements it could not economically meet, is a commercial failure by any reasonable standard. But commercial failure and cultural failure are not the same thing, and in the automotive world they are sometimes almost inversely correlated. The cars that sell in enormous numbers, that become ubiquitous, that everyone drives because they are the sensible, practical, mainstream choice, those cars do their job. They transport people. They generate profit for their manufacturers. They fulfill their purpose with varying degrees of competence, and occasionally with genuine excellence. But they rarely inspire the kind of passionate, irrational, deeply personal attachment that the thing inspires in the people who love it. Because inspiration requires difference. It requires the quality of being genuinely unlike the alternatives. And the thing, in its brief American life, and in its enduring collector existence, has always had that quality in abundance. It was different in 1973, and it is different now. And the difference has only become more pronounced as the 50 years that separate us from its American debut have filled the roads with increasingly similar, increasingly safe, increasingly compliant, increasingly competent, and decreasingly surprising vehicles. A thing parked on a modern street does not look like a vehicle from 50 years ago that has aged into irrelevance. It looks like something from a parallel automotive universe where the rules were completely different and somehow more honest, where the vehicle was exactly what it appeared to be, nothing more, nothing less, with no marketing language required to bridge the gap between appearance and reality. And I think that honesty, that absolute absence of pretense, is ultimately what people are responding to when they fall in love with these vehicles. We live in an era of extraordinarily capable, but increasingly opaque automobiles. Vehicles that do remarkable things, but that are difficult to fully understand, difficult to fully connect with, difficult to maintain without specialized equipment and dealer access. The thing is the opposite of all of that. You can see exactly what it is. You can understand exactly how it works. You can fix it with tools that fit in a modest toolbox. And you can drive it in a way that makes you fully, completely, and physically present in the experience, which is not a quality that modern vehicles, with their sound deadening and climate control and driver assistance systems, tend to prioritize. There is one more dimension of the thing's story that deserves acknowledgement before we close out this episode, and it is the dimension that connects the thing's American story to the broader story of where the automotive world was going in the early 1970s, and what that trajectory has meant for the cars we drive and the cars we love today. The regulatory pressures that ended the thing's American career were not wrong, exactly. The safety standards that NHTSA was developing were responding to a genuine public health problem. Traffic fatalities in the United States were at historically high levels in the early 1970s. The emission standards that the EPA was implementing were responding to air quality conditions in American cities that were, by any reasonable measure, genuinely harmful. The regulatory apparatus was doing what regulatory apparatus is supposed to do, which is protect people from harms that the market alone would not adequately address. But the instrument of that protection was blunt, and blunt instruments applied to complex situations produce unintended consequences alongside their intended effects. One of the unintended consequences of the safety and emissions regulatory framework of the early 1970s was the elimination of a certain kind of honest simplicity from the American new car market. The Thing could not survive because it could not be made compliant without destroying the qualities that made it what it was. And the qualities that made it what it was, the simplicity, the openness, the complete transparency of its construction and operation, were qualities that the regulatory framework had no mechanism to value or preserve. They were simply casualties of a process that was optimizing for measurable safety and emissions outcomes and had no variable in its equations for the preservation of vehicular honesty. That trade-off, safety and emissions compliance in exchange for a certain kind of simple mechanical directness, was the right trade-off in most cases and for most vehicles. But it came with costs. And the Volkswagen Thing is one of the most vivid examples of those costs made concrete and drivable and thoroughly, inexplicably, enduringly lovable. So there you have it. The complete story of the Volkswagen Thing in America. Born from the battlefield engineering of the Kübelwagen, developed for post-war military utility markets as the Type 181, imported to the United States as a lifestyle product with one of the most accidentally brilliant names in automotive marketing history, celebrated by surfers and students and everyone who wanted to drive something utterly unlike everything else on the road, then quietly ended by the intersection of regulatory reality and business math after 2 model years and 31,000 units, surviving in the collector market as one of the more sought-after and genuinely beloved oddities of the American automotive 1970s, appreciating in value from its $2,350 original sticker to the $15,000 to $25,000 range that nice examples command today. Supported by one of the most generous and knowledgeable enthusiast communities in the collector car world, and still capable of stopping traffic and starting conversations wherever it appears, which is exactly what it was capable of doing on that California dealership lot in 1973, and which is exactly why it deserves to be remembered not as the car that failed, but as the car that found its people anyway and kept them forever. Thank you for watching this episode of Motorsport Heritage. If this story gave you something to think about, if it sent you down a rabbit hole about things and Kübelwagens and the strange, beautiful intersection of military history and American consumer culture, please drop a like on this video because it genuinely helps more people find this content and join the conversation. Subscribe if you have not already, because we have a lot more of these stories coming. Stories about the cars that history treated better than the marketplace ever did. The vehicles that failed and won at the same time. The machines that the market forgot and the enthusiasts never could. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss what is coming next. And if you have a Thing story of your own, if you owned one, if your parents had one, if you saw one at a show and immediately understood exactly why people love these vehicles, leave it in the comments because those stories are the whole point. Until next time, keep chasing the weird ones. They are almost always the best ones.